So I can see people starting to filter in and numbers increasing. I'll just let people join before I start welcoming everyone. Numbers are still trickling in. So there's about 60 of you on the call now. Just so that you all know, you are automatically muted and your videos are automatically turned off. So you won't be able to see or hear each other. Don't worry, that's completely normal. We're on the webinar function on Zoom, so you will stay muted and your videos will remain off throughout the session. Just letting some more people join. So a couple of quick housekeeping points while people still filter in. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session, so there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and have them answered. Please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom and not in the chat function. We won't be able to monitor the chat function, and if you do put your questions in there, it's likely that we won't see them. So please do use the Q&A function. We will also be recording this session, so you can see on your Zoom screen that there's a little icon that says that it's recording. So we will distribute the recording and share that along with the slides in the coming weeks after our conference. And then finally, we will also be seeking your feedback. So you may see a kind of feedback survey in your inbox over the coming days or week. Please do keep an eye out, and we would love to hear what you thought of the session, but also our conference, our first conference more widely. So I can see that people are still trickling in. For anyone who's joined in the last kind of minute or so, you will notice that your video is turned off and you're also automatically muted. This is completely normal. We're using the webinar function on Zoom, so don't worry. Your camera will remain off and you won't be able to see or hear each other throughout the session. You can, however, interact with us through the Q&A function. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Please do pop your questions in there throughout the session, and we will have kind of 10 minutes or so at the end of our session today to answer some of your questions. I'm just going to give us another minute or so to let people join, as I can still see the numbers increasing slightly. So welcome everybody. I think we will begin to get started. I can see that people are still slowly joining, but it's slowed down. So for anyone who's joined in the last kind of minute or so, you have joined the conference session on survey design and validation. You're in the right place. And we will be presenting to you for about 40 minutes today before moving on to a Q&A session. So please do use the chat box at the bottom to input your questions throughout our session. So let's get started, and people can continue to join as we go. So before we kick off, I just want to quickly introduce us. So you can see that we have two panelists on screen today. I am Sherlock, the evaluation manager here at Tazo, and my colleague Zahra is also here. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself, Zahra?
Sure. My name is Zahra Boudalaoui-Buresi, and I'm a research officer at Tazo.
Thank you very much. So you can see on screen what we're hoping to cover today. I'm going to give you a kind of quick intro to Tazo, and then we're going to move on and get into our session on survey design and validation. So you may have seen when you signed up that today's session is marked as intermediate. We'll therefore provide quite a brief overview of what a survey is and how we use it, before further unpacking the concepts that we need to think about when choosing, designing and implementing our surveys. And so these concepts that we're going to cover are construct and dimensionality. We will talk through validity and we'll also discuss reliability. As I've mentioned, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the session, but don't let this deter you from popping your questions in the box as we present, and we will come to them at the end. So a quick introduction to TASO. This slide may be familiar for any of you who have joined other sessions over the last couple of days and throughout our conference. But as you can see, we are an independent hub for educational professionals. We're here to support the sector and to provide research, toolkits and evaluation and guidance. So we hope to work with the sector, and we also actually hope to kind of learn from you as well. I can see that we've got kind of over 150 people on the call at the moment, and they're all really valuable resources for us to kind of learn from and work with as well. So we're an independent charity, very newly independent. We spun out of King's only 2 weeks ago. We were set up by a consortium of King's College London, Nottingham Trent University and the Behaviour Insights team. And we're also an affiliate What Works Centre. So there's about 9 of these centres that follow the government approach to ensuring that we have quite high quality evaluation and evidence on what works, and also ensuring that our policy and practice is informed by this evidence. You can also just see at the bottom of the screen there that we're funded by the Office for Students. And I think this shows quite nicely the support that the regulator gives to this type of evaluation and evidence work as well. So one final slide to help contextualize us. So as you can see, at TASO, we think of evaluation as being reiterative, and this is quite nicely demonstrated by the kind of circular design that we've got here. And this process supports continuous involvement. So we hope that the findings from your evaluation in the measure stage, which is where we are today when we're thinking about survey validation, will help kind of inform and help you think about the reflect stage of your evaluation. In turn, that this reflect stage will help you think about the diagnose phase, so the kind of narrative evaluation, and then also feed into your plan. So thinking about the research questions that you want to be asking. And what we hope is that with each evaluation cycle, your evaluation becomes more accurate over time. So by repeating and re-refining your evaluation strategy, your findings become more robust and you can learn more about what works year on year as you go through this reiterative process. But today we are focused on step 3, so the measure phase, and we're going to be exploring survey design and validation and what is important to think about when thinking through how to use this method. So I'm going to hand over to Zahra to kick us off with a little bit of a background to what surveys are.
Thank you, Rain. So starting with the basics, what is a survey? A survey is a tool used to collect primary data. And primary data is the data that you collect yourself in order to obtain relevant information to answer program-specific research questions. So who uses surveys in the higher education sectors? Surveys are used by widening participation teams, student success team, and both by evaluators and researchers. How do we collect survey data? The most common form of surveys are face-to-face surveys, telephone surveys, self-administered paper and pencil surveys, and self-administered computer surveys, that is online surveys. So surveys are used in many different sectors. For example, the household census is a large survey happening in the UK this year. It happens every 10 years and it provides insight on the characteristic of all households and individuals living in England and Wales. And the results are used to support decision-making on planning and funding public services at the local scale on topics such as transport or education or healthcare. Most countries also use surveys to measure other important indicators, such as rate of unemployment or political opinions. Within educational research, self-report surveys have been employed for some time, both at the local, national, and international scales. For example, the OECD runs a worldwide study named PISA, Program for International Student Assessment, to evaluate educational systems by testing 15-year-old students. Surveys are also used to assess personal attributes such as attitudes about one's schools, teachers, or peers, or to measure personality traits such as self-esteem or self-efficacy. So if surveys are such an important research method in social science and policymaking, we would hope that they were well designed and accurate, right? Unfortunately, that's not always the case because survey design sometimes goes wrong. So the first example is a study conducted by students who asked participants to rank sport professional based on their personal perception of the athlete's GOAT status. However, the survey did not explain that they were not referring to the animal, but that in that case, GOAT corresponds to an acronym meaning greatest of all time. So this acronym is used in reference to high-skilled individuals in order to praise them for being the best in their field. However, not all respondents were aware of the meaning of the acronym, resulting in them thinking that they were being asked to comment on which famous athlete had the most GOAT-like characteristics. So a bit later in the presentation, we will explain a bit more about what went wrong here. But before that, let's move on to a second example of survey design not being to the required standard. Some of you may have heard of Anna's online dating exit survey that circulated on Twitter at the beginning of lockdown. With extra time on her hand due to quarantine, Anna created a survey to send to people who did not respond to her on online dating apps because she wanted to understand the common reason for why people would stop responding. While her research objective seems noble, the way she designed her survey questions may affect the quality of her survey data. As you can see on the slides, point 1 and 7 on her 7-point scale are very far apart without anchors for the points in between. So it will be difficult for Hannah to interpret her results. Secondly, when asking respondents to not comment on questions, Hannah hints that they should provide an apology, and this biased language is likely to influence the respondent's answer, and therefore it would skew the data that comes from this question. Now I'm going to pass to Rain to continue.
Thank you, Zahra. Okay, so maybe measuring GOAT status or trying to work out what it's like to date Hannah is particularly hard. So let's have a go at ourselves at looking at some more common examples, I guess, of things that we might all see in our own research when we're working in the field. So I'd like to just pause here for about 30 seconds and ask each of you to note down, just on a notepad or whatever you've got in front of you, which of the examples given on screen you think we could represent with a single score. So it might be 80 out of 100. I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to do that. Okay, so, and this may be a surprise to some of you, but interestingly, personality is the only example given that cannot be represented by a single score. So it's not possible to use one single score to talk about personality. Job satisfaction was in there as a little bit of a wild card. Technically, there are validated scales that suggest that we could represent job satisfaction with both a single score or using multiple scores. But perhaps most interestingly, all three of the other options, so self-esteem, depression, and IQ, can actually be represented using a single score. So to understand this and to explain why that is, I think we need to talk a little bit about measurement concepts. So I'm going to talk you through the slide that we've got on screen now. So first of all, what we want to investigate is basically what we call a construct. So a construct is the abstract idea or the underlying theme, or even maybe the subject matter, the thing that we want to measure and the thing that we want to ask survey questions about. So some constructs are relatively simple. One that is often used is political party affiliation. So I could ask Zahra about her political party affiliation using potentially one or just a few questions. But some constructs are a little bit more complex. So examples of things that we probably use quite often are sense of belonging, pre or post entry, but also things like parental engagement or parental involvement. These are a little bit harder and we need more questions or more survey items to be able to kind of fully operationalize these constructs. So in our sector, constructs tend to be pretty abstract and something for which we need a plan to measure or to kind of so-called operationalize it. So we do this using indicators, and an indicator can be thought of as a direct answer to our construct. So it helps us find a way to measure that construct. So for example, let's take the number of hours helping kids doing their homework as an indicator of parental engagement at home. Or quite similarly, we could take the number of meetings attended at school, and that would be an indicator of parental engagement at school. Now, often we have various indicators for one construct, so it's important to find the one that is most closely matched with that construct and reduces the distance between them. We then need to think about data collection. So once we have the indicator and we know what we want to measure, we have to run test scores or administer surveys and ask parents how much time they're spending with their kids, or even maybe gain access to school registries and see how many meetings they've attended at school that year. So for all of this measurement process, we need to be aware of something called dimensionality, which is a concept that helps us understand how we accurately measure the constructs that we are trying to understand. So firstly, a construct can be unidimensional. So this means that it's expected to have one single kind of common or underlying dimension that can be measured with a single test. Constructs can also be multidimensional, and this just means that they have two or even more, there's three in the example that we've got on screen, underlying dimensions that we need to be able to measure. As you can probably guess, in turn, we need to use scales or surveys that talk to the number of dimensions that our constructs have. So as we saw in the activity we did earlier, and some of you may have guessed this, some of you may not have, self-esteem is an example of a unidimensional scale. So this means that there is a validated scale that exists that allows us to measure self-esteem along one single scale. We should note, and you can see this in the example we've got here, that unidimensional scale may include multiple items, but that all of these items are essentially trying to measure the same common underlying dimension. So each of the 10 questions you can see on screen all map back to self-esteem. This is not the case for a multidimensional construct. So on the other hand, we need to employ kind of different items or tests to measure the dimensions of the construct separately. And then we combine these scores to be able to give us one common score for the overall construct, in this case, personality. So personality is made up of 5 separate dimensions, as you can see on screen. And for each of these dimensions, we might want to ask a number of different survey questions to help us gain an idea of what someone's overall personality is like. So thinking about these examples of unidimensional and multidimensional constructs, what we need to understand is whether the survey items or the indicators are actually measuring the construct that we're interested to observe. And so to make sure that the indicator reflects that abstract idea, we've spoken about parental engagement, for example, we need to think of something called validity. So validity means that we want to be sure that the indicator is closely mapped to that construct. So again, the idea of reducing the distance between them. So it's essentially the relationship between the concept and the indicator. Now, I should just note before we talk about validity that unfortunately, we can never be 100% sure because complex social constructs like the ones that we use in HE are often hard to translate into kind of neat, accurate and measurable data. For example, if we think about the abstract construct of parental involvement, but also measuring things like intelligence or confidence, they're quite difficult and abstract ideas. Nevertheless, we try to make our idea of our construct and our indicator not too far away from each other. So there are 4 types of validity that we're particularly interested in, and for each of these, we need to think about how our indicators map. So we've got construct validity, content validity, face validity, and criterion validity. And we're going to go through each with a little example. So construct validity tells us how well the indicator or the survey scale maps to the construct that we're trying to measure. So in other words, does the indicator relate to the underlying kind of abstract theory or the thing that we want to understand? So an example of this might be that we design an educational program that aims to increase artistic ability amongst preschool children. Construct validity would measure whether the research actually measures artistic ability, which is quite an abstract label, right? It's quite a kind of abstract idea. So content validity is a little bit different, and this is kind of assesses whether the indicator or the test, whatever the measurement tool is that we're using, represents all aspects of the construct that we're interested in. So to produce valid results, the content of the test must cover all relevant parts of that abstract idea of that construct. So the example that I've got on screen here is if we had a mathematics teacher that you can see on the left-hand side, and perhaps they are designing an end of semester algebra test. The test would need to cover everything that the algebra course covered in order to have high content validity. If some types of algebra were left out, then the results might be an inaccurate indication of the student's understanding of the subject. But also, if the teacher included some questions that weren't included in the algebra course in the first place, the results would no longer be an accurate measure of the student's knowledge, and so the content validity would be compromised. So back to Zahra's example that we saw earlier, face validity considers how suitable the content of a survey or a test is on the surface. And now this is not hugely dissimilar to content validity, but it's basically a less formal and more subjective measure. So as we saw earlier, asking a bunch of students whether or not they kind of how to rate their favorite athletes according to GOAT status has poor validity because the respondent has essentially kind of incorrectly assumed that people filling out their survey are going to know what GOAT stands for and not kind of misattribute it to an actual animal. So I know I said that there were 4 types of validity, but I do actually just want to sneak in kind of 2 subtypes under criterion validity, because I think they're particularly important for the work that we do within the HE sector and for practitioners and evaluators alike. So you can see here that we've got predictive validity and concurrent validity. So predictive validity tells us how well an indicator or a survey item predicts later performance on a related criterion. And I'm going to come to give you an example of that in a moment. But first of all, just to also help us understand concurrent validity. So this tells us whether or not a measure relates to an existing measure. And this is important because often we're trying to kind of come up with or design new survey items or scales to use. And generally concurrent validity is used when one assessment is new and one assessment is quite well established or it's already a validated scale. So the author of the new assessment, which might be us in our fieldwork, would want to make sure that there is high concurrent validity with the well-respected and well-established assessment that already exists. And that could be, you know, perhaps a new way of measuring self-efficacy versus the version that already exists. So predictive validity then, and this is one that you may be familiar with because we do use it a lot. So to give you an example, as anyone who knows me quite well and definitely my team by now, I have a great love, maybe sometimes an addiction for chocolate. And so I could, and I actually do often try to measure my affinity for chocolate against others. So one way to do this would be to measure my consumption of chocolate as a predictive indicator for how much I love chocolate. If I eat lots, it means I like it more, right? That makes sense. However, I'm also trying to be vegan because I'm one of those millennials who hears that it's good for the planet and all that. And so on days where I'm doing really well at being vegan and I'm not eating dairy products, I might eat less chocolate. However, that doesn't actually change how much I love chocolate. There's just this interaction happening, which is where I'm trying to avoid it in order to do a good deed for the planet. And so it's important to think about this when we're thinking about the kind of variables that we take note of in our work in the field. And an example that some of you might be familiar with is thinking about applications to higher education as a predictor of progression to higher education, or sometimes maybe even aspirations to attend HE as a predictor of actual attendance and progression to higher education. So that's Validity, a kind of whistle-stop tour. I'm now going to pass you back to Zahra, who's going to talk you through a second kind of concept that we're interested in.
Thank you, Rain. So now the second thing to have in mind when choosing your measurement is reliability. Broadly speaking, reliability is the relationship between an indicator and the final data that you get. So reliability tests whether an indicator is measured in a way that is consistent and precise. In other words, if we collect the same indicator several times, are we getting the same result each time? So in some cases, reliability is obvious. For example, if we measure the height of adults, if we do it 10 times, we should achieve 10 times the same measure. But other measurements are not as reliable as this. They don't match as perfectly, and that's when reliability is up for question. So we're going to look at 3 different elements included in the concept of reliability. First, we'll look at internal consistency, which is the consistency of people's responses across the item of a multiple item measure. Then we're going to look at inter-rater reliability. It is the extent to which different researchers are consistent in their judgment. And finally, we're going to look at test-retest reliability, which is the extent to which the scores obtained on a test or survey are consistent over time. Firstly, we just said that internal consistency is the consistency of people's responses across the item of a multiple item measure. As we have seen in earlier slides, in general, multiple items on a survey are supposed to reflect the same underlying construct. So people's scores on those items should be correlated with one another. For example, on the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, people who agree that they're a person of worth should tend to agree that they have a number of good qualities. But if people's responses to different items are not correlated with each other, it no longer makes sense to claim that they're all measuring the same underlying construct. And we can assess internal consistency by collecting and analyzing data. Secondly, we previously said that inter-rater reliability is the extent to which different researchers are consistent in their judgment. For example, if 2 researchers are observing aggressive behavior of children at a nursery, they would both have their own subjective opinion regarding what an aggression comprises. In this scenario, it would be unlikely that they will record aggressive behavior the same, and thus the data would be unreliable. To solve this problem, we can decide to operationalize the category of aggression to make it objective and easier to identify when it occurs. For example, while aggressive behavior is subjective and not operationalized, pushing is objective and operationalized. So it would be more reliable if researchers could simply count how many times children push each other over a certain duration of time. When we talk about inter-rater reliability, we focus on researchers, but measurement can also depend on the measurement tools that are used. For example, if I'm going on holiday and I decide to weight my bag with 2 different sets of weighting scales, my bag should weigh the same on each set of scales, otherwise there is a low inter-rater reliability. Finally, we know that test-retest reliability is the extent to which the scores obtained by test or survey are consistent over time. In other words, when researchers measure a construct, they assume to be consistent across time, then the score that they obtain should also be consistent across time. And test-retest reliability is the extent to which it is actually the case. For example, intelligence is generally thought to be consistent across short periods of time, meaning that a person that is considered to be highly intelligent today would be considered to be highly intelligent next week, right? So it means that any good measure of intelligence should produce roughly the same scores for an individual next week as it does today. Thus, a measure that produces highly inconsistent scores over time cannot be a good measure of a construct that is supposed to be consistent. The timing of the different tests is important because if the gap between two tests is too brief, then participants may recall information from the first test, which could bias the results. But similarly, if the gap between the two tests is too long, it is possible that the participants will have changed in some important way, which could also bias the results. There are other things that are harder to control for. For example, when using a test-retest method, one study found that measures of intelligence represented by test scores were much lower during the second round of data collection. That might mean that the test is not a good measure of intelligence, but that is not necessarily the case because what the researcher hadn't accounted for was that the second round of testing took place during a very hot summer day where participants were bothered and they found it hard to concentrate due to the heat. So it is important to be aware of the potential impact of these factors on the data that is collected. I will now hand back to my colleague Rain to wrap up.
Brilliant, thanks, Zahra. So I am going to use the example of a bullseye to sort of wrap up, but to also help us understand how these two things of kind of reliability and validity come together, and how we can think about that in our own work. So using the bullseye example, what you can see in the kind of bottom right-hand corner here is very high reliability and also high validity, and this is the center of the bullseye. So this is the dream scenario, right? This is what we're all kind of aiming for, and this is what we would like to have all the time. However, it's not always the case. So the second example here that you can see is a situation where we've got high validity but low reliability. And what this means is that if we do the same measurement 100 or 1,000 times, the average measure is close to the construct that we want to indicate. But the measure is not always reliable because if we do it several times, the result is not always going to be the same. So let's take an example of parental involvement, which is something, or parental engagement, something that we've talked about throughout. So using the indicator of number of hours spent with kids and kind of monitoring or helping with their homework, we can be confident that this is highly valid. If we do actually manage to get that data, if we're able to kind of monitor that, we can be sure that the amount of time spent with your children is a good indication of parental engagement or parental involvement. But the problem is that it's not always super reliable. So we can't always have surveyors in people's households monitoring how much time they spend with their kids, or surveyors in school monitoring how often parents attend school meetings. So instead we rely on self-report, or we rely on what people tell us, and there may be differences in what someone declares versus what they're actually doing. And this isn't to say that people are lying or that parents are kind of overinflating. It's often just a memory issue. So if we ask someone on Tuesday how much time they spent helping their children do their homework, they might say 3 hours. But if we ask them 2 days later, they might say 1.5 hours or half an hour. And this is just because their memory will have dropped over those 2 days. And so we can't always be sure that it's a super reliable measure. We also have the opposite situation. So you can see in the left-hand side that we have an example of something that has super high reliability, but in this case, low validity. And so what we see here is basically the opposite situation. So for example, the quality of children's homework is going to be quite reliable if measured on a clear marking matrix. But that doesn't mean that parents are necessarily engaged with their kids doing their homework, right? Or at least it feels a little bit dubious. And then the final example we have is the kind of the nightmare, the worst case scenario. So where validity and reliability are both quite low. So you could ask kids how well their parents were at engaging. So ask them how much time their parents spent with them, but children A are going to be subject to the same kind of memory deficit as their parents, but also they probably don't have a really clear concept of time and won't necessarily be able to give us a clear answer when asked such a question. So I appreciate that there's a lot of kind of theory and a lot of examples, and often quite abstract examples. And I wanted to sort of finish up by thinking through some things that we could all do, or at least some messages that we could take away from our session today. So the first thing to note is that where possible, it is good if we can use pre-existing validated scales. There are lots of scales that exist, and we do actually have on our website in the resources section a kind of common outcomes framework that helps map the outcomes that we're interested in the HE sector, and then scales that we might be able to use to measure those outcomes or those constructs. The second thing to think about is making modest changes to scales that already exist. So something that I've come up against a lot in my work in the HE sector is that a lot of the scales seem to be validated and designed in the US. And so therefore some of the wording is often not quite right, in that they might refer to kind of like freshmen rather than first year students, or they might refer to a grade point average rather than attainment grades. And we can make quite modest or small changes to the wording of these scales that makes them fit our context without changing the meaning too much. And that's a good way to move forwards. The third option would be that I actually just really encourage you all to have a go at applying some of the methods that we've discussed today. So you've seen examples of the test and retest that Zahra gave. So taking data that we have today and then data that we have in 3 or 6 months time, and looking at whether the results are similar or different. And I'm sure that many of you listening today already use things like milestone surveys and already have that type of data to hand. So it'll be interesting to think about applying some of the methods that we've seen. And then finally, just to flag that, of course, there is a fourth option. And I think we should, as a kind of community and a sector, hold this in our mind, which is that we can consider developing bespoke validated scales that are specific to the constructs that we're interested within the sector. So we've obviously talked today about parental engagement quite a lot. And I know that another one that I often come up against is kind of both pre-entry to HE and post-entry to HE sense of belonging. So how do we know whether a student feels like they belong at university? And designing and validating scales to help us measure these is, of course, an option that's available to us with sufficient time and resourcing and budget. So this brings us to our Q&A section of today's presentation. We've probably got about 15 minutes for questions before we wrap up. And I'm gonna, just like magic, bring in my colleague, Dr. Eliza Cosman, to help facilitate, thanks Eliza, just to help facilitate our Q&A. So if you could all just pop your questions in the Q&A chat box, and Eliza will do a lovely job of triaging those and putting them to Zahra and I.
Great, thank you, Rain. So we have one which from Louise Jones. She says you've kind of answered it already, but I think it would be useful just to go over it a little bit more fully. So Louise says she has pre and post project surveys using validated and existing questions, but they've recently done some focus groups with young people to understand how they interpret the questions, and they'd like to make some tweaks to the questions in the scales, which they think would make them more appropriate. But of course, that makes them slightly different from the validated measurement tools. So do you have any reflections on what that means for the robustness of the evaluation and the impact measurements, and whether we should be making these changes?
Thank you. I'll start, and then Zahra, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add. It's a brilliant question, and a very kind of practical question, and I'm sure a question that lots of people are kind of thinking about. Without knowing, I guess, to kind of caveat my answer, without knowing the kind of specificities of the scales that you're using and kind of how much you're tweaking them, it is hard to give a concrete answer. But in general, and as I sort of said on my wrap-up slide, I think as a sector, we can be confident to make quite minor changes to validated scales that already exist. And also that I would encourage us to do this over make up our own scales and start with a scale that is completely unvalidated. So where possible, I would say it's okay to change and to tweak scales that already exist, especially if it's things like I described, it's kind of differences in culture between the US and the UK, and therefore the students don't fully understand them. It makes sense to make those changes. Yeah, and I would encourage that over making up our own scales that haven't been validated at all.
Great, thank you. Okay, second question is from Rosanna McNamara. She says, although things like self-esteem, depression and IQ can be given a single score, does that mean they should? Could that be reductive? So why is it appropriate to use single scores for those items? Where does that come from?
Another really brilliant question. So I don't want to get too technical today. And of course, this conversation can become quite technical quite quickly when we're thinking about how we validate scales. But essentially, these scales that are represented or can be represented by a single score have gone through a survey validation process. And what that means is they have been piloted and tested, and a kind of series of factor analysis done. So we've done some, or not we, but the kind of authors have done some analysis on the data to look at what underlying, we talked about dimensionality, what underlying kind of constructs or factors people's answers map back to. And so for scales that are validated as unidimensional, so things like IQ and self-esteem, it is reasonable to assume that it is okay to measure those with a single score, because the factor analysis or the kind of component analysis tells us that answers do map back to that one underlying dimension. I should just again kind of caveat that by saying, as we saw with the kind of wild card of job satisfaction, often there are validated scales that suggest that a construct or an idea can be measured with both multi and unidimensionality. And that is part of the kind of, I guess, the flexibility or the noise that we need to be aware of in evaluation, right? There is no ultimate truth, and we're just trying to use the best evidence and research that exists to us, really.
Great, thank you. So we've got lots of questions coming in now, which is brilliant. I'm going to bundle a couple together. So we have Emma Angel, sorry if I got it wrong, saying, can you say a little bit more about how to test for retest validity? And then Rebecca Middleton says she'd be interested to hear a bit more about the appropriate processing for validating survey items and scales. So I suppose more of that kind of practical how you do it. I know you can't go into loads of detail now, but perhaps an overview of how we would go about that.
Yeah, of course. So test, retest, I think you mean test, retest reliability. And this, I think this is a good example to talk about because, as I mentioned, it's something that we may not be too far away from anyway as a sector. As I said, I think lots of people use kind of milestone surveys, and therefore we have kind of buckets of data that are gathered at multiple points, and we could feasibly do some analysis to look at whether they're finding similar things at each point that we take those measures. So yeah, in terms of how we do that, it's something called factor analysis. And perhaps we need to kind of make a note to self to do a second session on some of the more technical or how-to guides for this. But essentially what we would do is analyze the data that we get each time we use this survey. So each time we implement it with a cohort of students, and work out whether or not we are getting at, or whether or not we're measuring the same constructs, those same underlying abstract ideas or factors each time we ask the survey questions. And so what Zahra was talking about and what Zahra described is that for something to have high reliability, ideally we would be getting similar measures or similar data each time we ask those questions. And if it's vastly different, we might assume that the scale that we're using or the survey questions that we're asking have low reliability. Again, as Zahra said when she was presenting that slide, there are external things to think about, and the example of the hot summer day skewing students' score marks is something that we need to bear in mind, and we need to be able to, as researchers, think about these kind of external environmental factors that may also play into the measurements that we're taking and the items that we're using.
And just on that, actually, do you have any other examples of factors which might influence survey scores? So hot weather is a really good one, but suppose for our audience of WP practitioners, does anything spring to mind as things they should be taking into consideration when they're administering surveys?
I mean, there's a wealth of things to consider, right? So how we are administering and asking the survey, and again, Zahra touched on this a bit at the beginning of her presentation, but so we can use surveys, probably not so much anymore, but we used to physically give them out in a classroom, right, and ask people to fill them out with a pen and paper. And we need to think about things like who is asking the students to fill out that survey and what's their relationship to the person that's asking them to fill out that survey. Are they going to feel kind of either implicit or also explicit pressure to write certain answers? And that, I think that has been removed a little bit, maybe in the context of COVID, but also just generally as we move to digital formats and we're sending links to an online survey rather than kind of standing over a student filling out a survey. But we do need to be aware of the sort of power dynamics and the relationship between the person, the administrator, the kind of researcher, I guess, or the WP practitioner, and the group of students or the cohort that we're being asked to fill out the survey. And that's kind of like a researchy answer, but I also think in the context of COVID, we need to bear in mind that, you know, we're asking students scales today in a very different context to the one they existed in a year ago, or I guess now a little over a year ago, and think about how something like COVID or a global pandemic and the external environment that they exist in is going to really change their outcomes. It's going to change a self-esteem survey, but also maybe an attainment test, you know, a test score. So yeah, there's lots of a wealth of external and kind of environmental factors that we need to bear in mind and be aware of.
Another answer, sorry.
No, I was going to ask.
Another answer that I could give is, for example, if you do the first test and then you give feedback to the participants of the test, or the participant gain knowledge about what is the purpose of the test, then they might be tempted to be more prepared for the second time. So that could also bias the results.
Excellent, thank you. So getting some really good questions about the detail, and I think we'll be able to come to all of them, the questions I have here now in due course. But just to stick with this kind of detail point, Ben Edwards says he realizes it's not a one size fits all, but it would be good to know your thoughts on point scales. Are you in favour of having a middle point, for example, 7 item Likert scales versus 6? And do you favour making questions mandatory, but also having a do not know, prefer not to answer question? If you don't fancy answering the full question here, Rain, perhaps you could just also talk about our thinking on this as a topic.
Yeah, of course. I'm just aware of time. I think we've got a little bit of time, so I'll give a kind of brief answer, but the Likert scale question, or the kind of how we favour scales, is a really brilliant question, and one that, as you can probably imagine, we get quite a lot. So our overall thinking on this is that we do want to do a follow-up, whether it be a webinar like this or perhaps a more practical kind of downloadable resource. It is in our pipeline, and we will be offering guidance on Likert scale, so to be aware of that. But a brief answer is that I really don't think there's a correct answer in terms of how many points to have on a Likert scale. But there are a couple of sort of principles that I think it's good to follow. The first being that, so you saw in Zahra's example of Hannah's dating exit that she had a 7-point scale, and she had anchor points at either end of that scale. My first piece of feedback would be that where possible, let's have an anchor point for each point in the scale. So not just have a slider between 1 to 7, but have kind of the information, the detail of what each point correlates to. Whether we need a middle point, so whether we have kind of 4, 5, 6, or 7, there's pros and cons to both. The more points that we have, the more sensitive our scale is going to be. So the more we're going to pick up that nuance, especially at the top or the bottom end of the scale, which is preferable. But equally, what we often find when we come to do the analysis of scales that have 7 anchor points is that that respondents fall into few categories and we end up collapsing it for analysis anyway. And so often I say to people, if you're trying to use a validated scale that only has 5 points, but you'd really like it to have 7, the trade-off is such that it might be worth using the 5 points and losing the sensitivity and keeping the validated scale, because we'll end up collapsing it, or we may end up collapsing it anyway. But yeah, as I said, we will kind of watch the space, and there will be more on this.
So just on watching the space, actually, Hannah has a request to just pop back to the previous slide before we sign off. So perhaps if you just go back to that, then Hannah can have a look at that slide while we're continuing to ask any
just this one
questions. I think so. Hannah, let us know if that's not the right one. And then just on kind of next step stuff in this space, we have a couple of questions here. So again, Hannah has said, do you know of any upcoming work for creating specific validator scales for UK context? I think we have a similar question from Naomi saying, you know, we all use these similar scales, excuse me. And I think someone else asked a similar question. So do you have any, this is a Patsy question because I know the answer as well, but do you have any thoughts on what TASO could do in this space to help the sector find and use more validator scales?
Yeah, so we, and some colleagues on the call, I think I've spoken to about this, we're basically hoping to progress this work a little bit. And I guess our actions probably fit most into 3 and 4 on the slide that we're currently looking at. So helping the sector to do some analysis on things like the test and retest method and ascertain whether or not the scales that we're using are reliable and are valid. But then also slightly longer term, thinking about how to kind of develop and create validated scales for the constructs that we all use, the ones that we've discussed today, but that we don't have existing validated scales for. So I think sense of belonging is a big one, particularly post-entry sense of belonging. So it is, yeah, it's something that we're thinking about internally at TASO, and we don't have a kind of clear strategy yet, but we are hoping to be able to offer guidance to the wider HE community on these constructs or these ideas.
Thanks, Rain. And I just found the other people. So Ellen Austin, I think I can't see full surnames on the question, but also asked about us if we're contributing to the review of the NHS and NSS, and if we have any good examples of surveys for post-entry, so module program surveys. And I think the same thing as what Rain's just said. So we're not actually contributing to the review of the NSS, but we'd like to be able to comment on post-entry survey scales as well where possible. Ellen's also asked for us to share a link to the TASO webpage on surveys. I don't know, Zahra, you can pop that in the chat function so that people will be able to see that. And then just relatedly, Anna Byro says, the common outcome measures framework is very useful. Is it possible to have links to the validated scales in HE that we can consider, for example, the Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale? Yeah, so we actually this is something which we looked at behind the scenes to develop some almost cheat sheets and resources that colleagues will be able to use. We're just working out the logistics of that, because obviously some of these scales are behind a paywall. They're essentially in journal articles, so we have to be really careful about how we share those more broadly. So we have to establish the right way of sharing those scales so that we don't get stung by authors being a bit annoyed that we've shared them more broadly, but that is in the works as well. Sorry to answer your questions for you, Rain and Zahra, but I just thought I'd tick those 2 off. Andrew Avery, I think, has another question, which is about the detail of things. So he says, how do you integrate survey questions with validated scales and binary outcomes with more open-ended free text questions, both in the survey design and subsequent analysis? Any tips or pitfalls to look out for there? Great question.
Yeah, really good question. So what we tend to do is provide an opportunity for open-ended questions, so some of that more kind of free text qualitative responses, and at the end of each, so in the context of a survey, you might think of it as a section, but also it might be thought of as a scale. So at the end of each section, you might have asked about kind of confidence or self-efficacy using a certain scale. And then it's quite nice to include a open text box at the end of that section. And then similarly for the rest of the sections throughout your survey, so that for each kind of area that a student's being asked about, they also have an opportunity to give more detailed feedback. I think this is probably a bit more of a broader point, but I find that respondents, students in our context, like to have the opportunity to give more qualitative feedback. I think it can feel a little bit restrictive to only be able to kind of indicate the range of sort of emotions, experience, feelings that you have in given tick boxes. And so it's a nice practice to include that. In terms of analysis, then I would also so use the same kind of sections or thematic mapping to look at those qualitative answers that comes through. So you can kind of put them into buckets or themes depending on how you structured your survey, and then sift through that and do some kind of sentiment analysis. So look at what the main feelings, emotions that are coming through those open-ended answers are as well. That's a great question.
Great, thank you, Ray. I think we probably have time for one or two. If you have one more question, you can pop it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to use chairs. I'm not the chair, but I'm using my prerogative as a panelist to ask you one more question, which is around face validity. So you talked about face validity being this idea that on the surface, the questions seem to make sense and they're asking the right kind of question. Do you have any thoughts on how we can, because that feels like one of the easier types of validity to assess. So do you have any thoughts on how we can do that in the context of WP and student success, who we should be consulting on face validity?
Do you want to go, Zahra, or shall I?
Sure. So I think what is really important is to communicate with the end user, so the person who's going to respond to the survey. So for example, if you're creating a survey that is going to be given to students, it's really important to make sure that the survey will be accessible for students to understand. And we have a behavioral bias that makes us think that what we know and what we understand is also what others understand, but actually that's often not the case. So people who create surveys have to be really careful and maybe consult. It doesn't have to be a huge study or anything, but consulting a few members of the population that you want to test is always important to make sure that your survey is adapted.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think Zahra has said it really well, but I guess it looks like kind of small focus groups or just small sort of like tests and pilots with cohorts of students, definitely.
Great, so we've actually answered all the questions bang on time, so I'm just going to turn off my camera and hand back to you to wrap up, Ray.
Thank you so much, Eliza, and thank you all for your brilliant questions. So that's mostly it. We just have a couple of final slides which have actually come up in the questions, but just to point you to the resources that we currently have on our website. So at the beginning of the presentation, we sort of alluded to, or we spoke about the evaluation cycle that we use here at Tazo, the kind of iterative 4 boxes. And this can be found under the resource section of our website. And there are also actually pre-existing recorded webinars, not dissimilar to this one, that talk through each of those stages. So there's one for the diagnose stage that talks a lot about theory of change, and then equally for the plan, measure and reflect phases. So do go and check those out if you're interested. And then finally, just to say that we also have an evidence toolkit on our website. It can also be found under the resources section. And this looks at basically summarizing and kind of clearly gives you an indicator of the quality and level of evidence that exists for each of the interventions that we are interested in this space. So you'll see a page on mentoring, on summer schools, on advice, information and guidance. And again, please do go and check that out if you're interested. And that's really it, just to say that it's been great talking to you all today, and thank you all for coming. I can see that we had a good number of people join us today. And yeah, just to watch, we will be putting out more kind of guidance and webinars like this. We will take into account the questions that you've asked today and also any feedback that you give us after today. And we're really here to try and support and kind of upskill and help the sector. So thank you for helping us to do that. So that's it. I'm going to end the call for all of us in a couple of seconds. And this is also the last session of our overall conference. So thank you to everyone who's attended. I can imagine many of you joined other sessions over the last couple of days, and it's been really great to have you all albeit through a screen. So thank you very much. Hope to see some of you again soon.